I'm pleased to have an opportunity to speak on the motion put forward here tonight, and I'd like to congratulate the proposers of the motion for giving us the opportunity to debate this issue. Now, there have been some interesting things said here tonight, and one of the interesting things was the admission by the Minister of Finance that the bank debt actually cost us 800 million of the 8 billion cost of interest last year in the Exchequer, because there has been a gross exaggeration of the cost of the bank debt relative to the fact that we have been spending more money than we're taking in. But that does not make the bank debt fair. And it was always the intention, when we got to calmer waters, to seek to redress the unfairness of the way that we were saddled with the bank debt. Now, as a member of the government at the time, the issue we faced were two crises. One crisis in 2008 and a very acute crisis in 2010. In 2008, when we put the guarantee on the bank, it was basically to stop a run on the bank and stop us having a situation that we couldn't refund depositors in the bank. And the call at the time was, be it right or wrong, that if you were to try separate the different types of investments in banks, that actually you would precipitate the very crisis that you were trying to avoid. And there were a large amount of deposits in the Irish banks, including, off the top of my head, I think it was 50 billion in deposits in Anglo-Irish Bank, and about 40% of that were Irish deposits. But you couldn't easily separate them, and that was the issue at the time. In 2010, what happened was, in fact, due to international crisis, bond prices across Europe went up. And it went up for all the countries, including Ireland, and money started flowing out of the Irish banks. And we had to rely on temporary liquidity. And again, the prudent thing to do was to try to stabilise the situation and not to have a crisis. Now, does anybody believe that low interest rates across Europe, including in Greece, are the function of each individual economy? Or do they believe that it is a function of the stability of the European mechanism and of the euro itself? Because basically, when people were taking the punts with their money, it was on what they saw was the risk. I have never, ever, from the very beginning, thought it was fair that if somebody lends money to a second party and they lend it to a third party, that the first party could expect to get all of their money back. I'm not talking about ordinary depositors who act in good faith, who I think as a community, European and national, we should protect. But I'm talking about the bankers who lent the money in the banking system. But Europe at the time insisted that the first party get paid back. Well, my view is there should have been burden sharing. And I have to say that I thought, no more than Deputy McGrath here, and I think he put it very eloquently, I thought at the time of the Fiscal Compact, I thought that the Taoiseach was getting a deal on this, that there was going to be recognition that the Irish people should not have had to shoulder the burden because there were a lot of parties involved. Of course, nothing happened. And any write-down, or any, not write-down, but any extension of the debts and arrangements and low interest, I think it would be fair to say that Greece had more influences in those changes than the Irish government, and that basically the Irish government, without ever supporting Greece, piggybacked on the eyeballing that the Greek government did. Now, as I said, I applaud the motion put forward. But anybody who tells me that a significant write-down or whatever financial mechanism, I'm not fussy about the mechanism as long as it has the same effect, it reduces the burden on the Irish people. Any arrangements arrived at to deal with this issue in the Greek situation shouldn't penalise Ireland for taking hard decisions. And therefore, we should be in support of the peripheral countries, the so-called Portugal, Ireland, Greece, Spain, and you've Cyprus and a few other countries thrown in for luck. Italy, we should be in support of them in saying that the way the centre treated the periphery was unfair on two counts. One, the uncontrolled flow of capital out during the good times, and then the demand for all the money back in the bad times. And therefore, I'm absolutely astounded when I read the counter-motion put down by the government, which more or less seems to say, we're above all of this. We don't want our fair deal anymore. We can paddle our own canoe. We're not going to stand with the other peripheral economies, and particularly with Greece in its time of need. And secondly, we're not going to demand the fair play that the Taoiseach promised us back in 2012. And I find it hard to understand the rationale behind this, because I don't think there's any other country in the European Union that would be so soft about its own interests. In fairness to the German Chancellor and so on, she'll be clear about defending her interests. And this government seems to suffer from an eternal requirement to be the good guy in the class, not to kick up any trouble, not to demand anything, no matter what facet of negotiation you're involved in. I don't think that's good enough. And I think we should be calling for this debt conference. I think we should be standing shoulder to shoulder to say that the way this crisis was dealt with from the beginning was not equitable or fair. And that whatever difference we had about what we would have done in the times gone by, and I think, it's easy when you're outside the system to come up with very handy answers. You're going to let Anglo go bust, but nobody tells you what to do about all the depositors. The 20 billion of Irish depositors, where you're going to let them go bust. Remember, in the nationalisation, the one people who didn't get their money back were the actual investors in the bank, so we certainly weren't bailing them out. Or in the other banks, for that matter. So, Minister, you need a bit of backbone. You need to go over to Brussels and say, there's unfinished business here. And the Irish people are very annoyed that they wound out taking the full hit and that they're now being punished by your logic for getting their house in order, and that you want a share of any new deal that's done for Greece, and that the Irish people want it as well.